Why, hello there. I'm sure you're all wondering why I've called you in today, and that is because it is time for Groovy Grab Bag Volume 15, the gayest episode. Happy Pride Month, everyone. I'm part of the LGBTQ+ community, and this month is just as special to me as I'm sure it is to a lot of people watching this. The albums that I listened to for this episode were for the month of May of 2025. The way this show works is I take all of the albums that I listen to over the course of a single month, usually going between 30 and 40 albums, and I rank them based off of my enjoyment of them. Almost every single artist, with a few exceptions on this list, are queer or part of the LGBTQ+ community. The exceptions are, of course, some of the blockbuster releases. I try to keep up on some of the big name releases for the month. And there's one other exception, and that's just because I'm reviewing one album by that particular artist per month. We will get to it when we get to it. Every month I choose at least one artist to cover the entire discography of. This month's featured artists include Rufus Wainwright, known for his lush orchestral baroque pop, Sleater-Kinney, known for their hard-hitting punk and riot girl-toned lyrics, and Frank Ocean, of whom has a whopping 2 albums, but I wanted to get them out of the way because I've been meaning to review them for a while. Alright, I've been yapping enough in this intro. Let's go ahead and get this episode started, shall we? Unranked, Prima Donna and Dream Requiem by Rufus Wainwright. Yeah, I know I didn't bother reviewing these, but that's just because these are high-effort listens that I did not have the time for this month. Also, whether or not they count as an official part of the studio album discography of Rufus Wainwright is up for debate, and personally I just wouldn't do Prima Donna justice. I'm already not a lover of opera to begin with. Me having to drag out a whole ass libretto and having to follow the plot and translate everything, it's a tall order. I try to listen to each of these albums 3 times, and can you imagine how much time that would have taken? I know they're worth listening to, at least according to some fans, but I probably would have given that one a rotten review. And that wouldn't have been fair, because that's just one of the few genres that I personally can't stand. I grew up a choir kid, and you get exposed to opera a whole lot, and it's very easy to just get sick of it. And then there's Dream Requiem, which was released this month, and I was thumbing over whether or not to include it, but I decided to not include it because first off, it's a live recording, and in a lot of cases, those are approached in a different way than studio albums, so I decided no. And the other problem is that it's a Requiem Mass, which usually requires some music theory dissection, which I'm capable of, but again, that is time consuming. And I know that most of Rufus's music has a lot of rewards to be had from dissecting the theory behind it, but you don't exactly miss out on the entire point of the work by not doing that. So consider this entry as my attempt towards acknowledging the existence of these albums, because I know that the fan base is gonna moan and groan in the comments section. Number 32, Under the Covers by Colton Ford. Alright, so every month I do a bad album challenge, and trying to find a notable bad album by a queer artist where the reception wasn't just simply divided was a little bit of a challenge for me. Colton Ford, if you haven't heard of him, that's completely understandable because his impact, even in the LGBTQ+ community, is microscopic. He is a musician turned gay porn star turned musician turned gay porn star turned musician. He has a small but loyal fan base, but even a lot of the fans can't get behind this frickin' thing. And look, I'm just gonna say it right out the gate, Colton Ford doesn't give a fuck what the critics and haters have to say. And you know what? I have to respect him for that. But that doesn't mean I necessarily respect this album. First off, that fucking album title, dude, come on. You couldn't think of something more clever? You had to go with the most overused cover album title in the existence of the entire universe? Oh, but it's cheeky because he's a gay porn star. I don't care. There's a number of other puns he probably could have tried to go with. Boy, oh boy, is this thing a stinker. And let's go over why. First off, these covers range in quality. Some of them are just okay, but forgettable, especially the ones that fit the genre that Colton Ford does well when he's doing his own original work. But some of these are just plain old fucking cringe-inducing. There were moments where my face actively winced while I was listening to this. There are EDM versions of classic 90s alternative rock songs on here. First off, Losing My Religion by R.E.M. Have any of you ever been to like a 90s dance night and they try to throw on this song with some sort of forced electronic remix version of this song? Yeah, usually people start walking off the dance floor. They sit that one out for a good reason. This song was just simply not designed for this type of music. Give it an edgy industrial backdrop and you have some really cringy vibes going on, especially with Colton's nasally ass delivery. Motherfucker up in here thinking he's goddamn Ministry, being able to do those dark, moody, philosophical sort of tracks with that sort of backdrop. Alright, but that's not even the worst of it. You know that version of About a Girl by Puddle of Mud? Well, Colton Ford's version of Lithium would put that thing to shame as far as bad Nirvana covers go. The instrumentals on this just simply don't match the tone of the song, and Jesus Christ, just that vocal delivery from Colton. But it's not just his versions of classic alternative songs that suck on this thing. I would say the worst cover on this whole album is his version of No One by Alicia Keys. More like no one wants to listen to this cover. Am I right? Look, if you've heard the original, that impassioned borderlining on overperformance from Alicia Keys is one of the most iconic songs of the late 2000s. Part of the problem behind this album is that Colton is constantly punching above his weight vocally. Not that he's a bad singer, but he has very limited range and he is pushing it, to say the least. He tries to give that same level of delivery and he's just missing the mark dramatically. On top of that, if you're the type of person that thought that this song was missing a shikatunk sort of syncopated reggae-esque beat, I got news for you. No, it does not go well with this fucking thing. But that's still not even the worst of it. Oh my god. So remember, I said Colton's pushing above his weight vocally, and for some reason, he intersperses these songs with 30 to 40 second long interludes, which are just him singing the choruses to some of his favorite songs. Have you ever wanted to hear somebody sing Dreams by Fleetwood Mac in 4-part harmony with all of the parts being forced? In addition, they're using like these effects that sound very off-putting and are poorly produced. Whatever he did here, it sounds like somebody singing directly into a fan. It's just completely off-putting. Look, this thing is just not worth a damn. Don't waste your time on it. It's 69 minutes, and I'm not even gonna say nice to that. D-. Number 31, As Time Goes By, The Great American Songbook Volume 2 by Rod Stewart. I started this year by listening to a bad Rod Stewart album, and then I saw that he has several terribly reviewed albums under his belt. So I became morbidly curious, but there's no way in hell I'm listening to more than one of these hunks of shit per month. Last month I tackled the very first in his Great American Songbook series, and it was just a forgettable C-. I was expecting these to become slowly and progressively worse. I wasn't expecting the second title in the fucking series to be where it starts to tank severely. Every song sounds the same. Every single goddamn song sounds the same. Have you ever been to Sunday night at the casino where they have some guy singing lounge jazz music? That's all this is for 45 minutes every single time. He doesn't change anything from the originals. He just sings everything straight, just with that weird rooster crow voice that Rod Stewart's famous for. He even had the nerve to pull in Cher and Queen Latifah into this thing. Girls, are you okay? Did he hurt you? Blink twice if you need help. One of the most awkward moments from this album is his version of Someone to Watch Over Me. Again, this is still sung very straight, but there's a certain lyrical change that completely starts to rub you the wrong way. The original version of the lyrics is, "She may not be the girl some men think of as pretty, but to my heart she carries the key." Very sweet, right? How do you ruin those lyrics? I may not be the man some girls see as handsome, but to my heart, she carries the key. Narcissist much? The whole point of the song is to make your loved one feel special, and instead, you're trying to make yourself feel special in the middle of it? What the fuck, Rod? You know, one of the things I thought I was gonna escape by reviewing these great American songbook records was the stupid, cringy lyrical touches from Rod, but no, he just had to come in here and ruin an otherwise classic fucking song. This has the entire sex appeal of watching your grandparents dance to their record collection. And no, I'm not talking about the Zoomers' grandparents that listen to the cool shit from the 60s, 70s, maybe the 80s. No, I'm talking about my grandparent that listened to this shit. These apparently get even worse from here, and I'm already giving this thing a D. I fear for my future. Number 30, Salvation by Rebecca Black. Alright, let's get the positives out of the way. This album is under 20 minutes. Alright, now let's get the negatives out of the way. Congratulations, Terminator Salvation. You're no longer the worst thing I've ever experienced with the word salvation in the title. Look, Friday sucked as a song, but at least we can say that that wasn't Rebecca's fault. She was 13, she was preyed upon by a shitty music production company, and the woman can sing. She's displayed it to us several times. The problem with this album is not Rebecca Black's voice. It's the stylistic choices that she makes on here. This thing is a hyperpop record. Yes, hyperpop. Probably one of the genres that you would never associate with someone like Rebecca Black. It's hard to tell if her heart's entirely in the genre or if she's trying to ride out the fad. One thing I can say is that if you're not a fan of hyperpop, you're definitely not going to be a fan of this album. It lacks any of the charm or innovation from artists like Charlie XCX or Sophie. It feels like she's just kind of inserted herself into the genre, like she photobombed it and said, see, I was there, I was part of that party. These songs are loud, brash, obnoxious, and completely devoid of any of the spice, fire, or layers of vulnerability that make the genre staples oh so legendary. In some alternative universe, Rebecca Black was told by her rich millionaire parents, no, you are not making that song with that company. And Black went on to become a neurosurgeon or something and actually lived a much more satisfying life, not trying to constantly artistically prove herself. The music industry will eat you up and spit you out, and unfortunately it's eating Rebecca Black up and spitting her out, and for once we can actually blame her for this one. D. Number 29, Pink Elephant by Arcade Fire. Yup, here we go, another non-queer artist, another problematic figure, and I get to talk about them, and I used to be a fan of these guys. Look, Funeral is one of my most listened to records in my entire lifetime, but ever since the accusations against Win Butler from a couple of years ago came out, I've been struggling to bother listening to it. Not just that, but sonically, these guys haven't exactly been good since at least 2013. It's been well over a decade since they've released anything that's worth a damn. What is with them constantly going with this middle of the road, just no balls sort of rock? This was the same band that said, yes, we have a pipe organ. Yes, we have 14 goddamn members. What you gonna do about it? If this were any other band, this could have been a C+ or a B-. Just another run-of-the-mill indie rock album that's in the same style that we've heard since the late 2000s. Unfortunately, because of the allegations against Win Butler, we have to deal with some very cringy lyrical choices. Oh boy! Look, I'm not saying that Win was obligated to confront the allegations in the lyrics, but the way they decided to go about this was probably one of the most baffling decisions they could have gone with. So first off, let's briefly go over the allegations. He was accused of using his position of fame to try to pressure multiple women into sexual activity when they didn't want to, and after being told no, he would guilt them and try to be pushy. Whether or not there's any truth to these allegations, I don't know, but it has rubbed a lot of fans the wrong way. But if you listen to this album lyrically, it's hard to think think that he is anything but guilty. They've basically decided to try to paint Win Butler as this young romantic heartthrob, and he's 45. Dude, read the fucking room. I'm not saying that you can't try to still be a stud well into even your 50s and 60s, but you gotta know how to play the game, and this ain't it. It's like they're trying to do this course correction from those allegations, and it just does not stick at all. Also, it's just very cringy because when your wife is right there in the band, how can you do this and still look at her straight in her eyes and say that you love her? Okay, maybe there's gotta be a single song on here that's worth talking about, because even on the worst Arcade Fire albums, there's at least one or two moments. Not here, not a single track, not a single moment, just a complete fucking snooze fest. Even the closer, Arcade Fire, is known for their epic closers, whether it's In the Back Seats, The Sprawl 2, Mountains Beyond Mountains, or My Body is a Cage. Their closers are some of the best things that they've ever done. What do we get here? A song called Stuck in My Head, which is probably the dullest moment on the entire album. It's a song that stretches on for 6.5 minutes as Win Butler starts to do nothing but bitch and complain about the allegations without ever addressing them directly, but you know that that's what he's talking about. Cancel culture. We gotta talk about cancel culture. The youths, they're canceling me. And then in the lyrics, he doesn't say this verbatim, but he might as well just say, fine, since you guys don't appreciate me, maybe I'll just quit the music industry. Do it! Do it! Do it! Do it! Don't threaten us with a good time and then proceed to finish the song, Win. If you're gonna be an entitled, snooty little jackass, why don't you get off your little soapbox and tell us that the allegations are completely false and not being a fucking jackass about it? Or if they are true, maybe do some self-reflection and try to get some therapy rather than just coming out here and trying to say that you know what's best for everyone. This album pissed me off. It pissed me off more than the prior entries. And it is sonically better than the prior entries, which is why it gets a higher grade, but in principle, this thing should be in the F tier. D+. Number 28, Take All My Loves, 9 Shakespeare Sonnets by Rufus Wainwright. Oh goody, opera. Why should I even bother? Okay, so backstory. On the album All Days Are Nights, Songs for Lulu, Rufus included 4 Shakespeare sonnets that he turned into piano pieces. Those songs received a lot of positive critical praise, and Rufus continued to expand on the idea in some of his live shows. But I think he got hoisted by his own ego here. See, Rufus gets criticized a little bit here and there for being a bit out of touch. He was born into musical royalty and has never spent a day in poverty in his entire life. That doesn't mean that the man has not suffered the way the common man does, but that's not on display on this particular album. What this is a collection of several Shakespeare sonnets, including a couple that are being re-explored from the All Days Are Nights saga. But instead of singing them himself, he's having professional opera singers sing them. And this just feels like the most obnoxious theater kids getting together with the most obnoxious literary professors and concocting something that almost appeals to no one. I just kept asking, who is this for? And it's not terrible, it's just really fucking out of touch. And it's overproduced. Look, I really hate how bad some of Rufus's albums sound on their Spotify mixes, but this thing takes the goddamn cake. It's bad enough that you can tell that this thing probably sounds just as bad on a pristine CD or vinyl copy. And you can't chalk it up to being the fault of the genre, considering we've been recording songs like Ride of the Valkyries with fantastic dynamic range for well over 100 years. Overcomposed, overproduced, overbloated, way too many celebrity features, not enough of Rufus himself singing. Yeah, he sings a little bit here and there, but goddamn, it almost doesn't even feel like he bothered to show up. And I know that he's there. He's playing piano. Look, if you like doing this stuff, that's fine, but keep it to Shakespeare in the Park. Don't try to shove it down everybody else's throats. C-. Number 27, Path of Wellness by Sleater-Kinney. God damn, it took me a while to get around to Sleater-Kinney, didn't it? We had to get pretty deep in the list to even get to something that even resembles a bad album by them. Alright, so this was the first album that didn't feature iconic drummer Janice Weiss. She was yeeted out of the band in a very controversial manner. Depending on who you talk to, it was either just a cordial creative difference, let's part on good terms sort of thing, or if you read some of the articles that were leaked out by several publications, this was highly hostile. A lot of people say that Corin Tucker and Carrie Brownstein both felt slighted by the fact that Janet Weiss was always the one that received the most praise on all of their albums. And let me just say, as great as Janet Weiss is, Tucker and Brownstein are both really talented musicians in their own rights. It's just that Weiss attracts that much attention because that's how good of a drummer she is. Getting rid of the drummer didn't bring more attention to the positive attributes of Brownstein and Tucker. Instead, all it did was make us realize that they had some flaws ever since they reunited in 2015. This thing sounds like a run-of-the-mill indie rock record with some really admittedly good lyrics. I will give it that much. Look, I'm just gonna say it right out the gate. Sleater-Kinney align with me politically, and there is never a moment where I shake my head at anything they have to say. They started out as ardent feminists in 1995, and they never backed down. And also, unlike a lot of their Gen X counterparts, they never went the route of TERF. They stuck to their word and maintained their philosophical integrity, and I really gotta give them credit for that. But that doesn't fix this album. The whole entire rhythm section is just extremely muffled and forgettable. I can't tell you a single memorable melody off of this thing. I have nothing positive or negative to say. C. Number 26, Folkocracy by Rufus Wainwright. Rufus has many different flavors and colors. After his applauded return to form with Unfollow the Rules, Rufus decided to take another risk. Folkocracy is his attempt to rework a lot of classic folk songs to varying degrees of success. Some of these go back to the 18 and 1700. That's how old they are. The vocal melodies are extremely tight and gorgeous. The featured musicians are all utilized masterfully. It's nice seeing him reconnect with Martha yet again. His version of Shenandoah is probably one of the most haunting versions of that song I've ever heard. But for every Shenandoah, there's a couple of head-scratching moments on this thing. Look, I liked his rendition of Kalua Napua because it had an authentically Hawaiian-styled lap steel guitar, and the pronunciation of the words were great. But then following it up with something like Arthur McBride, which is an incredibly repetitive drinking song from way back when. And what he does is he tries to rework it in order to make it sound more dramatic and touching, and it just doesn't work. It just still sounds repetitive because those drinking songs were designed to be enjoyed by a bunch of rebel-roused, sloshed off of their asses people with nothing better to do back in the 1790s. Even in taverns nowadays, you don't see people singing songs like this because there's TVs on the screen or bands playing on the stage. And while it's also nice to see his version of Harvest be brought out from the graveyard of the Gap promotional CD from the mid-2000s, having a rendition of a song like Cotton Eye Joe, which is trying to sound serious and touching, just doesn't work. Cotton Eye Joe was designed for the dance floor of ye olden days. What are you doing? And also his version of Down in the Willow Garden, while good, he has Brandi Carlile there. You had to make me mention Brandi Carlile a second time in this show, a musician that I have no reason to talk about other than the fact that she worked with Elton John and now she worked with you. Look, this is a mixed bag. The good moments are enough to keep it out of the C tier, but some of the more confusing and baffling decisions make me almost want to put it into the C tier. B-. Number 25, Even on Arcadia by Sleep Token. I don't want to spend too much time on these guys, but one thing I just want to say is those people that hate on them, guys, come on. Look, these guys are to late Gen Z and early Gen Alpha, what Linkin Park were to late Gen X and early Millennials, and what 21 Pilots were for late Millennials and early Gen Z. Angsty bullshit teenage music. Not the cringiest thing in the world, but definitely a little bit on the more emotionally immature side. And I'm sorry if that rubs some of you Sleep Token fans the wrong way, but they really aren't God's gift to metal either. They're an excellent gateway band, don't get me wrong. But also at the same time, they don't deserve like the 2 out of 10 rating that Anthony Fantano gave them to calling them like metal for Disney adults. Like, buddy, go outside and touch some grass. There's varying levels of bad. You don't have to give something a really low score just for the sake of being contrarian. And I will say that some of the musicianship on here is pretty good. Apparently this is supposed to be like R&B fused together with metal, but honestly, it feels more like metal with small isolated moments of R&B just kind of cut and pasted and stitched in at weird moments. Neither their metal nor their R&B sound bad, but also it's not this enlightened genre fusion that so many people try to sell it as. Not the worst thing in the world, but also not the most notable thing. I'm gonna give it a B-. Number 24, Out of the Game by Rufus Wainwright. Oh goody, this is Rufus trying to do the Elton John shtick. But only Elton John can do the Elton John shtick. Look, I know that those musicians, the Billy Joels of the world, those solo singer-songwriters from the 1970s were a giant influence on Rufus. So something like this wasn't completely unexpected. But that being said, I don't think that this is his strongest suit. There are a few good songs on here, especially songs like Jericho that completely sweep you off your feet. And while none of these songs are directly bad, most of them just kind of range between okay and pretty good. This is also where we start seeing some of the overproduction in Rufus's style. His more ornate orchestrations don't always match well with the more stripped back singer-songwritery stuff, and it just leads to an album that's very hit and miss, even if it does hit more often than it misses. B. Number 23, Self-Titled by Sleater-Kinney. The very first Sleater-Kinney record is just under 25 minutes, and it's one of those punk Riot Girl sort of records. Riot Girl was a movement in punk that lasted from the late 1980s into the mid-1990s, mostly led by women, tons and tons of venomous lyrics, anti-patriarchal views, and just incredibly raw and aggressive punk done by women. And that's where Sleater-Kinney got their start, and that's most of what this album is. It's a flash in the pan, it's a fun little romp, but it also doesn't dig too terribly deep, nor does it really show off some of the best qualities of its musicians, even if the angular, jagged guitar stylings of Corin and Carey are already present by this time. They would continue to get better with each release. It's a charming first album, but not mind-blowing. B. Number 22, Little Rope by Sleater-Kinney. From the very first Sleater-Kinney album to the most recent, my initial review of this thing was very underwhelmed, and while it hasn't increased too terribly much in rating, listening to this within the context of the Sleater-Kinney discography did it a lot of favors. Also, I was not aware exactly how much Carrie Brownstein was mourning at the time of the release of this. Right in the middle of the production, her mother and stepfather were killed in a fatal car crash, which leads to Brownstein taking a lot of control over the vocals and the lyrical direction. And she is easily the strongest thing about this album. Carrie carries this album. You can hear the sadness and the anger seeping out of every word that she sings here. It just sucks that the rest of the complaints I have about this album still ring true. The rhythm section sounds like they're in a completely different room recording different songs. There's this disconnect between what the main band members are doing and what the session musicians are doing. It just doesn't have this shared vision. It feels like there's this secret club that the rest of the musicians aren't allowed to be in on. But hey, at least some of the catchier tunes on here caught my ear much better than they did on the first few listens. B. Number 21, Something Beautiful by Miley Cyrus. Miley is one of those musicians that I have very mixed feelings on. As a person, I really like her. She's always ahead of the curve as far as social issues go. She seems like a very fun and bubbly woman, and occasionally she can give us some really great tracks, especially off of this thing. I mean, End of the World is a banger. And whenever she does lean into that sultry, husky delivery, which I think she does best, oh man, she's like one of the best pop singers in the game. But whenever she does try to play by the typical pop princess rules, man oh man does she lose me. She doesn't do the balladeering thing all too well. And again, this is another one of those albums that a lot of music bros are giving like a 1 out of 10 to. Like, who hurt you? What this was supposed to be was this big epic piece of art that was supposed to handle traumatic situations and growth and healing. And that sounds all well and good on paper, but in its execution, it just doesn't quite hit it. This alternates between pop songs that kind of meander around a lot of different musical ideas, and especially when she tries to do that EDM club stuff. Like, come on, you're pushing your mid-30s now, Miley. Maybe it's time to slow it down a little bit, or amp it up, go full out Madonna on us, I don't know. But the thing is even when Madonna was doing those types of sounds, there was a certain finesse and maturity to it that matched her age. Miley's still trying to sound like she's in her early 20s, and it's kind of off-putting. Not saying women in their mid-30s can't party and have a good time is what I'm trying to say. Also, what I'm trying to say is, Miley, I like you. You seem like a really agreeable person, but when you try to hit me with the strobe lights and offer me your special candy, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested. B. Number 20, Poses by Rufus Wainwright. Alright, here come the torches and pitchforks. I'm not a safe man anymore. This album is one of the most cherished Rufus Wainwright albums out there. And look, on some levels, I agree with you people. On others, I don't. But also, I know that no amount of logic and reasoning is going to change your guys' mind. I am now the goddamn devil in some of your eyes. And look, when I'm done recording this, I'll gladly go running for the goddamn hills, because I'm sure there'll be a whole ass angry mob outside my door. But I'm gonna go ahead and go on my little rant. First and foremost, this album has some of the best songs of Rufus's entire career. Cigarettes and Chocolate Milk reads like an addict's manifesto, and I mean that in all the positive ways I possibly can. Tower of Learning is an incredibly haunting, touching song about being in love with somebody that you feel is so out of reach because you think that you're unworthy of them. In a Graveyard is such a gorgeous song that almost kind of reminds me of Enya because of how stripped back and ambient it is. His version of Across the Universe is like the best version of that song. Yes, even better than the Beatles version. I'll see you guys out there with the rest of the angry mob. But look, Rufus is at his best when he is pushing the limits of what the production of an album can handle, when he's shoving a whole fucking brass section in our face unnecessarily. This album took all the extravagancies of the self-titled and stripped them back, and I don't know if that was Rufus's idea or the record label's insistence. Whoever's idea it was a bad idea. From those weak, super soft, synthesized drum machine noises that he goes with on some of these songs, to just these moments that are commanding like thicker, bigger orchestrations and arrangements. It just doesn't pack the punch that you want. These are songs that deserve that level of creativity. And I'm sorry if that upsets some people. Maybe some people like the subtlety of this thing. Not me. B. Number 19, Call the Doctor by Sleater-Kinney. This is the album that came out just as the Riot Grrrl movement was dying. SK had to decide exactly what they were going to do to keep their sound relevant. And the solution was simple. Give us more of those jagged, angular guitar noises between Corin and Carrie. And look, this shit's fucking great. Just hearing them play off of each other, these melodies and counter melodies. And they're raw. These are not some professionally composed melodies. They break a lot of music theory rules just because it just sounds like they're noodling around and going off of each other. But they work. However, for the time, this does sound like a lot of Sonic Youth worship, and that's not by accident. The girls basically worshipped Kim Gordon. The production is much less dirty, but it's still pretty raw in the sense that they still want to honor their punk roots. But the best part of this are the drums. Wait, Janet Weiss isn't on this record. That's because the drums were provided by one Laura McFarlane on the first couple of records. See, McFarlane is often completely overshadowed, understandably, by Janet, but she was a titan of a drummer in her own right. And both Carrie and Corin really liked Laura. They wanted to keep her in the band, but unfortunately, since she was Australian and not entirely a legal US citizen, our good old immigration system, being as terrible back then as it is now, forced half this album to have to be recorded in Australia. Sadly, they would have to part with Laura McFarlane, but we'll go into what became of that as we move along. This album has a lot of heart, has a lot of grit. It's still a fantastic listen. It's Sleater-Kinney tiptoeing in the right direction to the legends that they would become. B+. Number 18, Love's Secret Domain by Coil. Another fan request. Look, keep throwing the weird experimental stuff my way. Some of that stuff actually sticks better than you would think. But this thing, I struggled with it. There are some songs on here that are catchy as hell. I could see myself getting down on the dance floor to them. Coil was very influential onto IDM and a lot of other modern forms of art dance music. They liked to lean heavily into psychedelia. There are times on here where I think I need to be tripping on shrooms in order to get the point of whatever it is I'm listening to. And that's because a lot of the time Coil did what they did because it was interesting to them. There wasn't necessarily a rhyme or reason for it. And yeah, there's tons of anti-religious imagery and lyrics on here, and I agree with that stuff. But I also want something that's a little bit more sonically appealing to me other than noise and loud and cool if you're on LSD. B+. Number 17, No Cities to Love by Sleater-Kinney. It's so cool seeing Sleater-Kinney go on hiatus in 2005 and come back together in 2015 and play together as if nothing had ever happened. And I do quite like this album, but for me, a lot of the post-reunion SK albums just don't hit with the same amount of energy as the best stuff from the earlier parts of their career. It is interesting seeing their lyrical voice change somewhat since 2015 was around the time the orange buffoon descended from the escalator. And these songs are really catchy, but I'm starting to see some of the spark start to disappear on the horizon. Still, some of the best songs from the band do appear on this album, and I would still recommend it to somebody who's doing a Sleater-Kinney deep dive. B+. Number 16, The Center Won't Hold by Sleater-Kinney. This is a controversial one, but let me say this and say this clearly. This is still a great album. Yeah, it has its problems, but we'll get to those. And if you look at it as a collaboration between the band and St. Vincent rather than a Sleater-Kinney album produced by St. Vincent's, it actually does a lot of wonders for it. St. Vincent still fucking slaps, even at her worst. And she's giving us some fantastic synth lines on this thing. It's not a true Sleater-Kinney album. I don't give a shit. It's allowed to sound different. A band is allowed to evolve their sound over time. Get over it. The only big complaint I have about it is the fact that Janet Weiss does sound kind of sidelined. Her drum parts are just so neutered here. And I know that part of the reason why is because her drumming doesn't necessarily match stylistically with St. Vincent's sound, but I feel like there could have been some sort of other compromise that was sought after here. But 1.0 on Sputnik Music, come on. Who hurt the Music Bros? Why are they constantly over-exaggerating how bad an album is? This one's actually pretty great in a lot of places, I would even argue. B+. Number 15, Unfollow the Rules by Rufus Wainwright. Alright, so Rufus has had a bit of an unfair reputation in the world of music. Most people either only knew him as the guy who did the version of Hallelujah from Shrek, or he had been entirely exiled from the snooty classical music crowd, because his music always straddles that line between classical and pop. But sometime around the late 2010s, his discography started getting massively reevaluated, even more so now in the 2020s. Many see him as one of the best Gen X composers. To celebrate this newfound revitalization in his career, Rufus gave us a love letter to every era of that career. From the more singer-songwriter-influenced stuff from his debut, to the intimate atmosphere of the Want duology, to the even more intimate atmosphere of Songs for Lulu. The best track on here is actually the electronic track Devils and Angels Hatred. It proves that he's able to do that electronic fusion without sounding weak. But unfortunately, he does bring back his out of the game era here and there, and that does create a couple of clunky tracks that aren't as enjoyable as the rest. But at its core, this is mostly Rufus Wainwright doing what he does best, but paying homage to his entire career up to this point. B+. Number 14, Dig Me Out by Sleater-Kinney. Oh no, here comes the torches and pitchforks again. I'm really gonna have to make a run for it after this, guys. This is, for a lot of people, the Sleater-Kinney experience. This album was created during a time of high stress for the band. Having just lost their original drummer, Carrie and Corin were in search of somebody to fill her shoes. And what they found was an even more dynamic drummer than McFarlane was. Enter in Janet Weiss, someone who brought a Led Zeppelin level of drum skill to a band that probably didn't need it, but definitely benefited from it. But that wasn't all the stress that the band was facing, having to replace their rhythm section. See, Corin and Carrie were in a secret lesbian relationship. And this is a big deal because back in 1997, if you were outed as a lesbian, that could mean your career or even your life if you were exposed to the wrong crowd. And they were breaking up. Originally, the lyrics were just going to be a little opaque, not completely direct. And then a few indie magazine publications just came out into the open and said, oh, take a look at this drama, which pushed the band's stress levels through the roof when they were already stressed the fuck out. This resulted in the band basically saying, fuck it, now that they know who we are, we might as well just embrace it. The lyrics became a lot more passionate and direct. The two were hurting and they wanted the world to know. Things were not working out romantically and they were stuck in this band together and they were completely uncertain about their future. This album is not intimate in the way that a breakup album like Blood on the Tracks is. We're not gonna see a couple of rugged individuals suddenly start to bleed from their hearts. No, instead this album sounds anxious and panicked and angry. The angular guitar playing is probably at its absolute peak on here. I would actually highly recommend this album to anybody that likes this type of indie rock. You're probably gonna eat this the fuck up, and for a lot of the time, I did. But I do have issue with some of that more stripped back, intimate production of the early Sleater-Kinney discography, and this thing still has a lot of elements of that, even if it is the best of that initial trilogy of albums from the band. It just sounds a little bit too thin, a little bit too subdued for me, but I do highly respect this album, and I would say this is probably the best entry point for Sleater-Kinney, A-. Number 13, Release the Stars by Rufus Wainwright. This is one of those albums that either you love it or you hate it if you're a Rufus fan. After the release of the Want To-ology, Rufus just got even more ambitious. This is the album that a lot of people like to point to whenever they say that Rufus Wainwright has a tendency to be way too over the top. And for me, this album was almost way too over the top. It feels like it places the skids at the exact place just before it would have fallen off of the cliff. This has some of the best songs of Rufus's entire career, from Sans Souci to Not Ready to Love, and then to the track that everybody knows this album for. Going to a Town is a political song, and it's probably the most subdued song on this entire album, at least until we start getting towards the middle. This is a political song written during the Bush administration, and it sounds like a middle finger to the modern Republican Party. And that's because in many ways, the Trump administration is just an extension of what the second Bush administration was trying to do. And this was written almost 20 years ago. You can hear every bit of dripping venom from Rufus's mouth. It's just an incredible, transcendent experience in a single track. And there are tons of spectacular moments on here. Like I said, it's almost a miracle that this thing doesn't sound brick-walled to shit and back. But that being said, when I say almost, there are a couple of moments where the production does fall off the cliff. Just because you maybe didn't need, like, the double brass section or an extra row of background singers here and there. You can pull back the reins ever so slightly. You're not Gustav Mahler. You don't need the whole society of musicians in your local city. This thing is mostly really impressive, and I'm glad that it's starting to get reevaluated by history. A-. Number 12, Self-Titled by Rufus Wainwright. Written at the exact beginning of his meth addiction, Rufus's very first solo album proved that he would be a contentious individual in the studio. He bumped heads with the producer because he came with 56 songs in mind. And the producer was like, we're not putting 56 songs on an album. And between the clashes and the constant musical changes and tweaks, this thing ended up costing more than $1 million. That is 1 1/3 the cost of Loveless. And of course, it all came out of his own pocket. Okay, maybe Rufus is a privileged individual. And these songs are absolutely stellar. They're some of the catchiest of the entire Wainwright catalog. A lot of those extra bells and whistles that he throws in here, they're doing a lot of heavy lifting for songs that absolutely need them. The biggest problem that I have with this is that Rufus's lyrical voice does feel a little neutered. And I know the reason why was because he was trying to hide his meth addiction from the world, because he knew if word got out about his issues that it would probably completely tank his career, given the crowd that he had a tendency to attract. But because it feels very at a distance, it doesn't feel nearly as personal or as close as the best Rufus Wainwright albums do. But for the most part, this is still a very strong and stellar release that I'm glad I listened to. A. Number 11, All Hands on the Bad One by Sleater-Kinney. You know, after I finished Dig Me Out, I thought I was gonna struggle with the next two albums because my issue with Take Me Out is that I was underwhelmed by it. And the two albums that come after it are less critically praised and aren't exactly held in the highest esteem by the Sleater-Kinney fanbase. But here I am to tell you that All Hands on the Bad One, as well as its predecessor, which is coming up right around the corner, are both very underappreciated Sleater-Kinney records. This is probably their catchiest album without going into the post-reunion discography. These songs feel like they could have fit like a glove with that post-punk revivalist movement that was headed by the Strokes and the White Stripes. Hell, you can see some of the makings of what would eventually become Karen O's vocal styles here. Just that wild, shrieking, shrill tone that they go with, completely confrontational. But also it always works with that angular, jagged approach that the Corin and Carrie dynamic brings. This is just a really solid album, and I had a dumb smile on my face. A. Number 10, The Hot Rock by Sleater-Kinney. I told you that this was right around the corner. I was trying to decide which one I liked more. I like both of them for generally the same reasons, because they both don't take themselves as seriously or as urgently as Dig Me Out does. As a result, it's allowed to be catchier and more fun, but I feel like this one's still a little bit more intimate than the one that came after it, which is why I like it a lot more. And while it's polished, this is definitely a very sad album, as Corin and Carrie are still dealing with the aftermath of their breakup and having to be in the same band together despite that. The fact that the two have remained friends for well over 30 years from the time they broke up is really impressive. The Size of Your Love is probably one of my favorite Sleater-Kinney tracks, and that thing sends chills down my spine and almost made me tear up a little bit. I was not expecting a bit of a string section from a Sleater-Kinney experience. This thing is a lovely, much more fun, much more polished album than its predecessors, and that's why I like it so much. A. Number 9, Obsidian by Babs. This is another album that was made while its creator was going through hell. Babs is an electronic artist whose initial release was a bit too fun and bubbly to leave enough of an impact on most listeners. And people were expecting more of that quirky indie boy sort of approach with his second album, but holy hell did life kick Babs in the balls. And not just in the balls, but directly in the rectum too, because he had one of those diseases that almost claimed his life. And look, we can make jokes about it, but those experiences are still awful. They're painful, they're embarrassing, they make you have to really dig into the filth of the world. And that's what Babs kind of does on here. He went from being a bright and bubbly, cheerful individual to just this really nihilistic asshole almost. Songs like Melisma Sky could not have been written by somebody who wasn't on their goddamn deathbed. There are songs on here that talk about the emptiness of anonymous sex, the difficulty of having to face your own mortality at such a young age, and the fragility of the human body. Sonically, this sounds like if you had taken the Postal Service, stripped them of their crippling anxiety, and replaced it with crippling suicidal depression. This album basically asks the question, what's the point of living life if I'm just gonna shit myself to death? Not that he ever says those words verbatim, but the poor guy was going through a lot. Mortality does weird things to you, and maybe I'm not the biggest fan of Babs's nasally vocal approach, but he makes up for it with an enriching, if dark, experience. A. Number 8, Channel Orange by Frank Ocean. Frank only has 2 studio albums, and the fact that neither of them rank outside of the top 10 tells you everything you need to know about the guy. Channel Orange has a really great motif, basically kind of doing the same thing that Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age does, where it sounds like you're constantly changing channels, but rather than changing radio station, it's more like you're changing a TV channel. You're switching between various memories and emotions, and that motif works to this album's favor. Now, Ocean is a stellar singer, but being a stellar singer in and of itself, you're a dime a dozen. There's so many good singers out there that there needs to be something that you bring to the table, and Ocean brings a generation-defining sound to the table. Channel Orange technically follows the rules as an R&B album, but it has a very forward-facing perspective. Orange has a fantastic ear for melody, and he learned that sense of melody from spending his childhood listening to Motown records. But then he blends it with the futuristic aspect of electronically produced beats, and it creates something completely otherworldly and unlike anything else released in 2012. I'm currently going through the Mary J. Blige discography, and the R&B genre was struggling to find its voice in the 21st century, as a lot of the artists from that genre were still doing that same approach from the 1990s. And Frank pushed the genre well into the 21st century. And this guy can go way up into his upper register. That falsetto is just phenomenal. But he makes you work for it. You have to listen closely to the song and get the build up in order for it to pay off the most. The guest musicians on this thing also pull a lot of weight. Frank and a lot of Odd Future in general didn't really let you appear on an album unless you were really going to leave an impact. And from Andre 3000 blowing your balls off on guitar, to Beyonce actually taking a bit of a backseat as a backing vocalist on a track, to even John freaking Mayer sounding good, even if it is only for 3 minutes, Ocean makes sure that these featured artists elevate the record rather than just sound like they're slapped on there for the sake of a single release. Even lyrically, this thing shines. It's a very conversational, confessional approach, which, yes, we're gonna have to talk about it, was founded by R. fucking Kelly. Look, that doesn't mean that Frank Ocean condones R. Kelly. It just means that R. Kelly founded a lot of the modern R&B tropes. That intimate, conversational, almost braggadocious approach, that was all founded by R. Kelly, as much of a monster as the guy is. But Frank does take this approach and he makes it his own. He talks about one of his first ever crushes being a man. He talks about having grown up being poor. He talks about various traumas that he had to deal with as a black man and a black gay man. This is an absolutely fantastic record, and while Frank Ocean is playing by the rules right now, he's at his best when he's breaking the rules. We'll see what that leads to, but this album gets an A. Number 7, One Beat by Sleater-Kinney. Man, it feels like Sleater-Kinney were just on an upward trajectory from roughly 1997 to 2005. This album was recorded in the aftermath of 9/11, as well as the celebration of the birth of children for both Carrie and Corey. There was a confused approach. The band didn't know whether to mourn the tragedy that the nation was facing, or whether they wanted to celebrate the newfound motherhood, and the solution was actually to do both. Because Sleater-Kinney saw the country going in a very dark direction that they didn't want their own children to have to grow up in. This album is very anti-capitalist. I would even go as far as to say that it dug its nails into the Bush administration 3 years before Green Day would make it cool with American Idiots. This album is loud, it is urgent, it is calling attention to a nation that is about to lose its status as the world's one superpower. It pulls no punches. It calls out the military-industrial complex for what it is. It is not afraid to point fingers. It is not afraid to blame everything on capitalism. They'll even go as far as to say that a 9/11, with the way America was running the world, was an inevitability. And it's done with some of the most intense dynamics I have heard on a record in years. This is almost Sleater-Kinney's best record. The melodies, the angular, jagged guitar playing, it is perfected by this point. I highly recommend this thing, even if there is one Sleater-Kinney album that I recommend more. A+. Number 6, Roadrunner, New Light, New Machine by Brockhampton. Hi there, guy that I've been kind of, sorta, somewhat clashing with me not really liking the albums he's suggested to me. You suggested something that ranked really high. Thank you, buddy. I was not anticipating that. I've heard the name Brockhampton recommended to me quite a bit, but I'd never thought I would actually really like these guys. So I know that the initial string of albums are technically sonically better, but they are also tinged in controversy because one of the members of Brockhampton turned out to be a groomer, and I'll probably get to those if and when I can stomach that given that fact. But this album thankfully does not feature that guy, because this is like post his departure. This is actually the final Brockhampton album, and if you haven't listened to Brockhampton before, their little style of hard-hitting hardcore hip-hop with Backstreet Boys / Boys to Men boy band approach might sound absolutely absurd, and I thought it would be absurd at first, but goddamn does that actually work. This plays out like group therapy in the best way possible. A rapper will go on a tirade about his own traumas, and then it'll be followed up by this touching group hug that comes in the form of these 4 to 5 part harmonies. This is the type of stuff that you hear in a Boyz II Men record, where they're talking about how much they're gonna make love to you. But instead it's a big warm, it's okay bro, you're gonna move past this and you're gonna live the best life you possibly can sort of feeling. And one of the members is dealing with the trauma of his own father having committed suicide. This is some heavy-handed stuff. You know, I saw like a music critic that I started following on YouTube. I forgot his name off the top of my head, but he said that Brockhampton was a phase. This certainly as fuck does not feel like a phase to me. This feels like a band that I should be digging deeper into, but because of the unfortunate nature of one of its members, I'm not sure I want to. But despite all of that drama, I still very much enjoyed this thing, and I'm glad you finally threw something at me that clicked with my tastes. A+. Number 5, All Days Are Nights, Songs for Lulu by Rufus Wainwright. On October 23rd, 2023, I had waken up from a drunken stupor. The night before, I was just enjoying myself, but I was also very much an alcoholic wreck. But I got woken up before I was ready to. My younger brother, my older brother, and my mother were bombarding my phone. This was very abnormal. When I finally came to and called my mother back because she said, "This is an emergency, you need to call me back immediately," it was on a conference call with my older brother and my estranged younger brother. My father had passed away at the age of 60 after suffering a second heart attack. I had a complicated relationship with my father, to say the least. My father was in many ways a person who tried his best to raise us, but also he failed to do his job as a father. He was abusive both physically and mentally, and he created an atmosphere in which me and my siblings constantly terrorized and harmed each other. But because my father was in the military, I spent a lot of years idolizing him, despite all the harm he had caused me. And it wasn't until I dated a transgender individual and hearing him misgender my partner where I started to question, was he really the man I had idolized for all of these years? Or was he the man that my mother divorced for good reason? And when I was stuck having to live with him for a few months back in 2023 prior to his death, I started to realize the way in which he would mentally manipulate me and gaslight me. And I slowly started to fall out of love with my own father. And when I found out that he had passed away, I didn't feel sadness as much as I did relief. And it created this really awkward dynamic between me and my siblings because both of my brothers, they hadn't fully processed their own traumas. And in many ways, I will continue to carry those pains to my grave because a lot of what my dad raised me to be led to some of my worst behaviors. But I never went to the funeral because I wouldn't be grieving the man that I thought was my father. I would be grieving the man that created a lot of my own personal messes. To this day, I still haven't gone to the grave. You might be asking, what does this have to do with this album? And that is because this album is about grief. Rufus recorded this thing right before and just after the death of his own mother. Rufus has a big history about family connection, both good and bad. His own mother, Kate McGarrigle, was part of a legendary sibling folk duo from the 1960s and 70s. When she died, the Canadian press were all over it because of how much of an impact she left. Wainwright's father, Loudon Wainwright III, was also a famous folk musician. His own sister, Martha Wainwright, also has a career in music. So to see the Wainwright legacy pan out to basically this makes you kind of start to think about your own mortality, your own grieving. Because this album is a mess, but it's a beautiful mess. This was critically eviscerated upon release, getting consistent 1 to 2 star ratings, because this doesn't feature the big pit orchestras and brass sections that Rufus became known for. This is Rufus alone at the piano, no additional musicians. Because of his hurt, because of his heartache and his pain, he wanted it to be heard intimately, and that would be lost if he had piled on all of those vast string sections and backing vocals that he was known for. Critics called this self-indulgent, but I ask the question, don't we all get a little self-indulgent when we grieve the loss of a loved one? Because eulogies are not created for the dead, they're created for the living. And Rufus, hurting as he was, wanted to let out his voice as it was heard at the time. Yes, this has a song that sounds surprisingly upbeat for such a depressing album with Give Me What I Want and Give It To Me Now. Yes, he recreates one of the songs from his opera on piano, where he ends up having to reach into the piano and play around with the wood and the strings in order to emulate the sound of fireworks going off. There's a series of 4 tracks on here, all of which are Shakespeare sonnets. They all encapsulate Rufus's mental state at the time. Even if it doesn't always make sense, the fact that this is a man in this state at this time in his life is incredibly beautiful. He looks back on his own childhood, his own messes, his misconnections. He realizes that he too one day will die, and it makes him want to make sure he doesn't approach life in the same flawed way as he did before. And even if I didn't have the best relationship with my old man as Rufus did with his own mother, I can see a reflection of myself in this. This is one of the darkest albums ever recorded as a result. It's not a man on the precipice of suicide. It's not somebody suffering from a disease. It's somebody processing their grief and not necessarily doing it in the most constructive or productive ways. Rufus would tour this album giving performances alone at the piano dressed in all black as Lulu, a character that represented all of his darkest and worst impulses. This album symbolizes him both embracing and letting go of Lulu. This is Rufus truly and completely maturing as an adult in his mid-30s, and that's why I give this thing an A+. Number 4, Blonde by Frank Ocean. This thing was met with a ton of confusion at the time of its initial release, but now it is seen as a generation-defining masterpiece. Channel Orange played by the rules so that way Frank Ocean could throw all the rules into a blender and set it on high. Do you like structure? Well, fuck you. There's not a single structured song on here. You know what's interesting is that I'm going through the Mary J. Blige discography right now, and I'm just now realizing how the album My Life was incredibly influential on Blonde, in the fact that Blonde similarly doesn't have any catchy hooks. That doesn't mean that the music isn't absolutely gorgeous, but we don't have any earworm choruses on this thing. The closest we get is Nike's, and even Nike's is a broken, messy song. Blonde takes all of what made Channel Orange work strongly, all the confessional lyrics, all of the future-facing production, and completely twists and turns it, mixing it in with the glitchy, messy production of Death Grips as well, translating it almost perfectly into the R&B space, without sacrificing even an iota of the beauty that makes Blonde what it is. Blonde will abruptly change its sound in order to prove a point. The lyrics constantly look back on nostalgia and life events, but instead of being wistful, instead of looking for meaning in those memories, he asks the question, great, so you have all these nostalgic memories, you have all of these traumas, all of these pains, but does it really help you in the long run to trap yourself in the past? This album is like the sonic representation of a mental spiral of dissociation. All of the abrupt musical changes tell a story. They paint a portrait. It shows that you're not always going to get closure. You're not always going to get defining answers. Life sometimes just happens and there's no rhyme or reason behind anything. And sometimes that can be incredibly painful to have to process. But process it, you must. must. There is not a wasted note on this thing. This is one of the best albums of the 2010s for a reason. I love this album. I'm glad I gave it a shot, but I just gotta say, Frank, can you please give us an official CD release so that way I don't have to pay $500 for your CD copy that comes in a dinky little bag? I get the point. You want everyone to be able to listen to this, and this is intended to be listened to on streaming services, but please, for the love of God, I don't have a vinyl collection anymore. I collect CDs. CDs are becoming popular again. Please release an official CD copy of this. Otherwise, S. Number 3, The Woods by Sleater-Kinney. Look, this month has been absolute hell for me. Between dealing with the political turmoil that has my anxiety set aflame, I learned in the middle of last month that I was at risk of losing my job, not because of any performance issues on my part, but because the company was just slowly automating everything and they didn't need us anymore. I have since dodged the work guillotine, but at the time that I listened to The Woods, I was an anxious mess. I was uncertain about my future. I didn't know how things were gonna be looking for me within the next 30 days, let alone the next 30 years. It made me realize change is inevitable. It's gonna drag me kicking and screaming into every single new era of my life. And when I listened to this thing, it dragged me into the woods, it beat the shit out of me, and then it threw me out the back, and then I came back wanting more. This is a visceral album that found me at the exact right time in my life. Instead of being stripped back, this album is a lot more thick in its production. I don't want to say lush, because this is quite the opposite of lush. This album can get downright fucking abrasive at its most intense moments. This is Sleater-Kinney completely going balls to the wall with what they do best. Look, I mentioned prior that this band doesn't have a bassist, but if you listen to The Woods, you would find it hard to believe that Sleater-Kinney doesn't have a bassist. I know that there's whole conversations that Sleater-Kinney fans have saying that they don't have a bassist as a way to protest how the bass represents the masculine overtones, blah, 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 blah. It ain't that deep, buddy. They just don't want a bassist. But it pays off. I mean, it gives them a lot more opportunities to show off as guitarists. And Janet Weiss's drum parts, oh my god, chef's fucking kiss on this thing. The rhythm section just completely obliterates you. You know, I keep hearing a lot of comparisons between the drumming styles of Janet Weiss and Led Zeppelin, and this album explains those comparisons, even if the bands are part of two completely different sonic worlds. And there's a lot of really interesting production choices on this album. See, this thing knows that it's part of the Loudness Wars. It doesn't give a fuck that it's part of the Loudness Wars. The fact is that when I put this on my high-end stereo system, I had to turn the volume way down, and it was still pretty fucking loud. And then there's even a moment on here where they make it, like, completely clip on purpose for artistic effect. And this thing is just a brutal album. It's something that you wouldn't expect to be made by 3 skinny ladies. This is the type of shit you would expect from some hairy nutjob man in his mother's basement. And I'm not saying that as an insult, I'm saying that as a compliment for completely subverting our expectations. And of course, the lyrics on here are much less direct than on other Sleater-Kinney records. They're very much metaphorical, almost allegorical. Some people think that this album is about life and how a journey through the woods and the interactions with various critters represent the traumas and the enemies that we make in our life. Of course, Sleater-Kinney has never stated directly that they're allegorical, but what are we as music fans if we don't overreach every now and then? The darkest song on here is Jumpers, a title of which probably sent shudders down the spines of post-9/11 America. But rather than it being about jumpers out of the World Trade Center, the lyrics take excerpts from diaries of people that tried to jump off the San Francisco Bridge, both survivors and also people who perished. It's an attempt to show exactly how much people suffer from suicidal depression. By the time they end the song by repeating the line 5 seconds was the longest wait, you know you're in for a special lesson. This thing does not hold your hand. It beats the shit out of you, it is ruthless, it is vengeful, and I absolutely love it for that. S. Number 2. Technically 2 albums, but I'm gonna count it as one. Want by Rufus Wainwright. Or if you prefer, the Want duology. In 2002, Rufus had hit rock bottom. His meth addiction and his endless nights partying with orgies had finally caught up to him. It got to the point where he had lost his vision because of his meth addiction. You know, we try to look at meth addicts as these trashy trailer park types of people, but at the end of the day, they're still people. They still get sucked into addiction just like alcoholics do, just like sex addicts do. It's all coming from the same thing. The inability to cope with the cruelties of the world and needing to constantly relieve yourself with endless dopamine release. Rufus subverts those expectations by being a rich white boy. Rufus realized that this was completely unsustainable and it could eventually kill him. So Elton John, of all people, got him in touch with a rehab program that had rehabilitated many different celebrities, including fucking Eminem, of all people. And yes, we can talk endlessly about Rufus's privilege and his ability to get clean, whereas most meth addicts are not so lucky. But the fact that he got himself clean and he made the Want duology in the process of his recovery is one of the most inspiring stories in the music industry. A couple of these songs were written while he was in the middle of a meth high, especially Go or Go Ahead. But each one of these songs was reworked and recontextualized into a sober mindset. Noah's Now Here, Smelling of Junipers, Fell Off Her Hay Bales, and Over the Rainbows. But oh Medusa, kiss me and crucify, this unholy notion of the mythic powers of love. Look in her eyes, forget about the ones that are crying. Something that can have a dual meaning. It can either mean the bliss of the high of meth or the illusion of bliss, especially the use of Medusa as a figure. It's still unknown how many songs Rufus came into the studio with. It is accepted to be much more than his debut, which again was 56 songs. But it was enough material for Rufus to try to release a double album. To this day, we don't know what happened to that double album, except that it was released in 2 parts as 2 separate albums, which is why I consider this part of one overarching work. We don't know if it was him that decided this, or if it was the studio, or if it was a financial decision. It doesn't matter. To me, I can't listen to Want 1 without the darkness of Want 2, and Want 2 always feels like the darker half to something that's missing if I listen to that in isolation. Now, I'm not saying you're gonna have a bad time with either of these albums if you listen to them in isolation, but they are best experienced back to back. Want 1, like I said, is the brighter of the two, and for many people, it is the superior album. It was Rufus doing victory laps after having suffered the worst aspects of meth addiction. Whether we're talking about the flamboyancies of Movies of Myself, or 1111, or the defiant Vibrate, which is about completely ignoring the people that are trying to text you that were addiction contacts. One of my favorite tracks is Natasha, a song that was written about a woman that was begging Rufus for help, but because Rufus was completely rattled with his own situation, all he could do was write a song for her. And that song is gorgeous. Probably one of the best moments on the album. Harvester of Hearts is a song that is very Newman-esque in all of the best ways. Rufus advocating for gay rights, all while being a little bit self-deprecative. The first half of this double album closes with Dinner at 8, a song that encapsulates the complicated relationship Rufus had with his father, an argument that sparked as a result of a discussion of Rufus's sexuality. the weird, complicated tension of hating him but loving him at the same time, all with this beautiful string production. But we're not done yet, because we have Want To, which is darker and more experimental. I used to struggle with Want To. Now Want To is a necessity. From the stark and depressing rendition of Agnus Dei, to his reimagining of The Art Teacher, to even his queer solidarity song Gay Messiah, Want To ain't no slouch of an album either. And of course, we can't talk about Want To and not talk about Memphis Skyline. Rufus had only ever met Jeff once in his entire life. We talk about this legendary friendship between the two, but it was only one time that they ever got to meet before Jeff tragically drowned. When Jeff died, Rufus was advised of this mid-addiction, and he was more obsessed with his own artistic endeavors than he was concerned about the death of somebody that could have been an incredibly close friend. Rufus would spend a good chunk of his adult life processing this missed opportunity, and it culminates in this song, a song that speaks of jealousy, that speaks of a gay fantasy that would never come true, because it's human. He's allowed to be in love with somebody who is both physically and emotionally unattainable. The whole thing ends on Old Whore's Diet, a song that is so stylistically different from the rest of the album, but it works. At almost 9 minutes in length, it is the coolest way he could have walked out on this. Many musicians start to become boring and complacent post-addiction, but Rufus gave us his best work in a career-defining masterpiece with the Want duology, S. So, what tops that? It's not by Sleater-Kinney, and it's not by Frank Ocean. No. This was something unprecedented. It's a blockbuster release. I haven't felt this excited about a new album since Desire I Want to Turn Into You by Carolyn Polachek. Some of you probably already know what's coming, especially if you paid attention to the thumbnail. Number 1, Sincerely by Kali Uchis. God, what can I say about this thing? This thing hit me out of fucking left field. Sure, maybe I won't love it more than Want in the coming months as I do my year-end roundup, but right now, I'm fucking in love with this album. And it's a perfect way to end Queer Month, because Kali is herself a queer woman. This is an album that was written during a point in Kali's life in which she was both anticipating the birth of a child and also dealing with the grief of her mother dying from lung cancer. None of the songs were written post-death. The death happened after the album was completed, but she's still very much grappling with that. Whereas Rufus is alone in a room dealing with reflections on his own mortality, Kali is the type of person that reaches outward when she grieves. So she's exploring various relationships from throughout her life. This album is structured as separate little letters written to these people in her life. Hence the title, hence why there's that little comma after Sincerely. That's not a typo, that's literally a feature of this album. These letters range from a confusion as to how her partner could accept her given all of her flaws, a song written to a woman that is suffering abuse at the hands of her own partner, and Kali expressing romantic desire directed at that friend, to Kali's reflections on her own mother, to the incredibly touching closer, I Love You So Much It Hurts. That song's gonna go down as a generation-defying song. Mark my words, by the end of the summer, we are all going to have that fucking thing stuck in our heads. But it's not just the lyrical and philosophical themes that Kali gives us here. This is a very intriguing fusion of 1960s girl group doo-wop music, a la Julie Cruz, I would say, R&B, both classic and modern, and then also dream pop. The rest of her albums are not this dreamy. This is actually completely left field. That's part of the reason why some of her fanbase are having issues processing this album, is because this is Kali going complete alternative indie girl. But this thing is gorgeous. It is slathered in so much reverb, and it's almost as if she threw this album into a wash cycle, and that wash cycle was like dousing it in reverb. And then she took it out and she's like, no, this isn't done. It needs more reverb. And somehow it's not overpowering. And another thing I really liked about this is that this thing has dynamic range. I actually had to turn my sound system up when I listened to this on CD. In the year of our Lord 2025, that's a good thing. There's a difference between being brick-walled and part of the loudness war and not giving a shit about it, using it as an artistic decision, and then like giving us much more dynamic space and range. This album is absolutely gorgeous, and I think it's gonna be my year-end favorite, provided something that usurps it doesn't come up. I highly recommend you listen to it. It's surprisingly emotional and dark. The bass lines on this, I forgot to touch up on those. God, they just cut through that hazy production and atmosphere and just give us these melodic lines. They're so fucking good. Please check this album out. I highly demand that you do. If there's one thing you take away, if you don't check out Rufus Wainwright, please listen to Kylie Uchis. S. And there you have it. Pride Month is over, and I am exhausted because next month I have 41 albums I have to review, but we'll get to those. Thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video. Share it on Reddit, please. I need more people to watch this series. I love talking music even if I can't do it for a living. See you guys later.